What's up, fans? This is Flight of Icarus with MetalTrenches.com, and since we did an interview this week and didn't really have time to cover some new bands and new albums, I thought it was a good time for another short-form review. Today I wanted to talk about progressive death metal band Dark Helm that are out of India. They just dropped Hymnus De Antitheist on Christmas Day just last year. They like to kind of mix up more traditional progressive metal with, again, those death metal elements and also some kind of traditional instruments from the region, which gives it a nice little added flair. And it ends up being a pretty interesting crossbreed of bands I've been listening to over the years. So if you kind of take the really groovy, syncopated riffs from Meshuggah, Born of Osiris's kind of Eastern-influenced synth approach, that kind of Sumerian sound that people call it, not just because of the label, but because it kind of has that sort of ancient vibe. And then a dash of Tool's progressive post-metal, then you end up with something that ends up pretty close to what Dark Helm are dishing out here. And the first track really does kick off with that kind of bouncy, energetic, Born of Osiris kind of synth approach. That's sort of what I ended up thinking that I was going to be in store for, but there's really a lot more to it than that, because this 7+ minute track ends up opening up into a much more interesting, again, kind of post-metal tinge with a very kind of Tool vibe. I was thinking of albums like Anima and Lateralis, and it was very interesting. There's definitely, maybe even you could throw in sort of a little bit of Mastodon in terms of the songwriting, not so much the overall sound, but just kind of that dynamic interplay between the heavier and quieter parts. I like that they do kind of focus more on the heavy, kind of gent-styled riffs, very infectious guitars, and mostly very gruff, gravelly death metal vocals. But again, they like to switch things up. You've got tracks like Lost Laments, which are much softer, and then also the closing track, Fallacy. But for me, the real gems are songs like Obey, which is another nice kind of cross-section of everything that these guys are dishing out. It kicks off with this really impressive, clanky, very, again, kind of Meshuggah-esque bass line, and builds into this very heavy riff with these really intense vocals. And then, again, kind of starts weaving in these more traditional progressive metal elements and the singing, and it works really well on this track. I think this is a great example of when this band is at their best in their songwriting and they're perfectly balancing out those two elements. There are some parts of this album that kind of slow it down a little bit too much for me, start to get a little bit bored, but for the most part, they do a really excellent job. Embers is another really great track, definitely on the heavier side, starts off again with these really crunchy, fast, hard-hitting riffs, really great drums too, definitely a technical aspect to this band, and also once more kind of incorporating the clean vocals in a really good way. There's a kind of catchy pre-chorus, and then also there's this really epic ululated singing part that really brings out that Eastern regional vibe. Probably one of my favorite singing parts on the album. Speaking of the drums again, if I could just name one more track, Asleep at the Wheel is really excellent. It has kind of a slow burn, quiet intro, and kicks into these drums that are just super kind of mathy. The time signature sort of jumps around. There's a lot of like start-stop, punch up notes here, punch up the snare here and there. One of those tracks that, you know, I kind of joke that there's music that makes you bang your head in the traditional way, kind of, you know, back and forth. And then this is one of those songs that makes you kind of do the weird, like, side-to-side sort of horror movie neck jerk kind of motions. You know, not the traditional 4/4 tap your foot kind of thing. So yeah, overall, this is a really excellent album. It demonstrates a lot of promise for Dark Helm. These guys are clearly technical performers. They're pretty dynamic songwriters. I think they still have a little way to go in terms of that last piece. Sometimes, you know, the slower post-metal elements are incorporated better than others. But on the whole, really great stuff. Really close to just completely knocking it out of the park. Because even when they stumble, it's very minor. I really enjoy this thing. So again, kind of favorite tracks, Eulogy, Embers, and Obey, and also Asleep at the Wheel. I ended up giving it a 9 for enjoyability. I knocked off 1 point just because, again, there are some lulls in the album that kept it from quite getting that perfect 10 status. Very close, though. I mean, you kind of drop 2 tracks from this album and the entire score leaps up. Musicianship, gave him a 9. I was toying with maybe a 10 for this, but I've heard more advanced technical playing than this, so I can't give them that perfect score, but they're definitely up there. And then for innovation, I gave them an 8. I think this album is a little bit different than a lot of stuff I've been hearing recently. There's a lot of familiar elements, which kept me from giving it a higher score than that, but it stands out enough, and they end up holding their own in a sort of unique space that it felt fair to give them more than just an average grade there. So overall, gave them an 8.7, which is a really strong B+. Can't wait to hear more from these guys in the future. I think they definitely have an A or A+ album in them in the very near future. I just say, don't rush it, take your time, and this could end up being maybe the most exciting act coming out of India right now in the metal scene. As always, I'll have links down in the description of places you can check these guys out and listen to the full album. Hope you enjoy it. The only way to encourage these bands to grow and get better is to support them with your hard-earned money, so pick it up. But that's it for me right now. If you haven't already, please do subscribe to the channel for more reviews, podcasts, interviews, track premieres, and other content. Check out our Patreon page if you want to support us. And of course, check out our latest episode of the Trench Talk podcast. This week we talked with Sammy from Insephorum, and it was a very enjoyable interview covering a lot of different stuff from just his long time being in this band, seeing the folk metal scene sort of change over time, and then also his side job as a kindergarten teacher back in Finland, which was an interesting twist. So check that out. Let us know what you think on all of our social media pages, and of course, I will see you in the trenches.